Okay. Bienvenidos. Welcome to Don't Miss This. It's just a different way. We have never started that way before. I'm David Butler.
I don't know if we'll ever do it again.
What?
I don't know. I'm Emily Freeman. And this is Don't Miss This, everyone. And we're about to teach you Thessalonians. And this is the problem. We're recording late at night again.
Yeah. And we're a little punch drunk.
Only one of us is.
Okay, so we're going to start doing 1st and 2nd Thessalonians today. A lot of Bible scholars think this is Paul's earliest letter of all of them that he wrote. Remember, they're in order of biggest to littlest, so or longest to shortest. So but they were different.
Yeah, but they're not in order of how they were
when they happened.
Written.
So if you want to know the story, you can go back to First Acts, the only book of Acts, First Acts and Second Acts. Acts chapter 17, where Paul and Silas are there in a city called Thessalonica. Isn't that a cool way to say it? And they've established this church there, but it was a really, really Greek and Roman centered city, really dedicated to the Greek and Roman gods, Zeus and Mars and all of those people. And so when this church started to form, and it started to form really fast, and they all started to declare that Jesus was their one true king, it caused a lot of trouble because Caesar was supposed to be the king. And so all of a sudden they were being, accused of defecting against Caesar. And so it caused a lot of collision between the groups. And you might remember from Acts that Paul and Silas had to escape in the night and get out of the city. So they've been so worried about what has been happening inside the city because they're that the whole church could have been crushed. They could all be dead. They could all be in jail. And so
they could have been talked out of even being members of the church.
Right. He actually talks about that in the beginning. He was maybe they've been convinced to abandon the message altogether. So they send Timothy into the city to go see what is going on, and he comes back and says, "You're not going to believe this. Not only are they not crushed, but they are flourishing and they are growing so strong." So Paul writes this letter both to just say wahoo, and then also to just give some advice and help encourage them and keep strengthening them and everything. So that's First Thessalonians. We'll talk about Second Thessalonians when we get to that spot, but that's kind of the background and what's going on with this letter.
So we're going to take a second and let you look at the board. Anyone who wants to look at the board, there you go. And we'll walk you through what's happening on here. We're going to start out right in 1 Thessalonians. And there is a part on the worksheet that talks about how to walk with God. And we read that in chapter 2 is where we're going to be. And this is one of my favorite parts of Thessalonians, is this part, because it teaches us so well how to care for one another in the church. And just as we're watching over everyone and ministering to each other, what should that look like? What should that feel like? How exactly should that work? And it's so interesting because I fell in love with this many, many years ago when the ministering program was still called the Visiting Teaching Program. And I'll never forget walking down the street to go and visit the person we were assigned to go and visit. And I had felt really impressed in just my praying and thinking about that family, about a couple things that I felt like we needed to do in the home. And the person who I was with felt really impressed. We were just supposed to teach the lesson, the whole lesson, exactly as it was written. Remember when they used to come to you in the ensign?
Yeah.
And you did the ensign. And on our way there, we kind of had to talk back and forth and reconcile how that visit was going to go, because we both had such different promptings of what was going to happen. And we kind of had that talk about this is what we're supposed to do, as opposed to this is what maybe we feel like we should do. And we settled on something right in between, and it ended up being fine. But it was shortly after that I read this part in Thessalonians, and it made me really start thinking about what it looks like when we go into someone's home to visit. What should that really look like? And this is what it says. I'm just going to read little bits and pieces of the parts that stood out to me. It's in chapter 2. And in verse 7 it says, "But we were gentle among you." And then in verse 8, "So being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because you were dear to us." And right when I read it, I wrote at the top, visiting teaching, because that is how many years ago I read that. But I thought to myself, I think this is what visiting teaching is supposed to look like. Is we're not just supposed to impart the gospel of God only, but we're supposed to impart our whole souls to those people who we've been assigned to go into because they are dear to us. And it made me really rethink.
And that was verse 8, by the way.
That's verse 8.
It
made me rethink how I walk into people's houses. What's my agenda? What's my purpose? What am I hoping to do when I get in there? And if the thought is just to do whatever they need from me because they're dear to us, and I'm willing to give them everything I have, whatever they need from me because they are dear to me, that totally changes what that visit is going to look like. Shortly after that, I was assigned to a new companion, and I was in my 30s at the time, and my companion who I was assigned to was 95 years old. And I can remember when I got my paper looking at it and thinking, who got inspiration for this? Because I'm so little, and that lady is so old, and we won't have anything in common. And I can remember walking over to meet her. I don't know why, but it felt like I didn't know if she used the phone or whatever because she was 95 years old. So I thought I would just walk over and introduce myself. And I walked over, and she was outside in her front yard, and she was planting 100 yellow tulips. That is true. It was in the fall. She was on her knees planting. And yellow is my favorite color.
I couldn't wait to find out what she was doing.
Are my favorite flower. And right as I sat there and talked to her while she was just planting away, I thought, I am going to love this woman. And I did. I loved that woman with my entire heart. She became one of my dearest friends in the entire world. We spent years as visiting teaching companions. She died when she was 102 years old. I had the opportunity to speak at her funeral when she died. And I won't forget the memories of being in a visiting teaching companionship with Verda Dallin. I will never forget those memories because she was a woman who knew what it meant to give her whole soul. And because she did, she became dear to all of us, everyone who had the opportunity to be with her. So if you are someone who is struggling with your ministering call, maybe just stick this scripture up somewhere in your home, on your refrigerator, or on your mirror in your bedroom. But just think to yourself, maybe it is too much of a duty. Maybe you've got to get to the point where you're figuring out how to give your soul because those people who you have been assigned to are so dear unto you, and what will make them dear.
Yeah. And we called this section Walking with God because of those experiences. That's what it feels like. With assigned people and unassigned, the experiences that you have with companions, with strangers, with all the people. I was reading recently from Mother Teresa, who began, that ministry in Calcutta, India. And for a long time she struggled with, is God really here? And then she said she had this moment where she sat with a dying man in her lap. And she said, I looked into his eyes and realized I was staring into the face of God. That it was in those ministering moments that she actually did walk with God, like literally felt like, and she quoted Matthew 25, where, as you love and minister and visit, it's unto the least of these, my brethren, it's unto me. And that's just a neat thing. And Paul uses...
So good. And before you move on, I heard this quote this week, and I didn't know you were going to share that. Otherwise, I would have pulled up the quote, but we'll put it in the newsletter, that talked about... she says, when you say yes to God, you don't know what you are saying yes to. And then she talks about what it means to say yes to God. And it is such an amazing quote. So I'll stick that in the newsletter. But also let's reference right down to verse 12.
Yeah, I was going to... So what he does was kind of neat. If you notice in verse 7, when he says, even as a nurse cherisheth her children... that comes from the translation of that as a nursing mom. So he says, he's like, we loved each other like a nursing mom loved her baby. And you would never say like, oh, that was a duty. Like there's an affection there and there's a love that was different. And then he uses even just as tender, and he says, and we loved each other like a father loves his children. And he says, that's how you take care and love each other in the church, like a mother does to her kids, like a father does to his kids. And he uses a couple words here I really like. In verse 11, he says, you know how fathers, they exhort and they comfort and they charge. And that's in verse 11. And in verse 12, they show you how to walk worthy of God. I love the way the Message says this. The Message is what's the word you use?
Paraphrase.
A paraphrase Bible. A first-class Bible, that's what I use. And he said, with each of you, we were like a father with his child, holding your hand, whispering encouragement, showing you step by step how to live well before God, who called us into his own kingdom, into this delightful life. And those are neat words to think about. So good. Sometimes you have to do all those. We've talked about that before, whisper encouragement. And sometimes you have to charge people and kind of help them see like, hey, this might not be the best, best route for you. And that's so hard as a parent. Jenny and I were just talking about that just this afternoon. Like, we hate being the bad guy kind of and pointing out things that have to be, I especially, like, I'm never...
I was just going to say, who is the bad guy at your house? Do you need me to come over?
Yeah, could you? Because I even said to Jenny, I was like, I don't understand why I have to be the bad guy to prevent the kids from becoming bad guys. You really have to, like, lay down your pride and everything and, be in uncomfortable situations to love.
Yes.
Right? Because it's
so
worth
true.
it. So we love those tender comparisons that he makes to what it means to look out for each other.
And we've left you a couple places to just write down some of the words or the phrases that stand out to you. What does it look like to walk with God as we minister and as we go into people's homes? The next part we love, it talks a little bit about the rhythms of holiness.
And this is P.S. where Paul starts getting into the spot of like, okay, let me give you some advice and let me give you some like how to keep, on this gospel path.
And I love the thought of this part. There's a whole bunch of good parts in here. You're going to find more than just that one rhythm. And in fact, all over on this part of the paper, you may end up wanting to write a couple more things because he's giving a lot of really good counsel. But this is one of our favorite. We're going to be in 1 Thessalonians 4 now. And in verse 7, he says, for God has not called us unto uncleanliness, but unto holiness. That uncleanliness is important as you think about that because what he's teaching you besides just uncleanliness, what is holy would be different than what is common. And sometimes common, the word for common is one that is also close to what uncleanliness is. So it's just the thought of that, of the opposite of holiness would be uncleanliness, or what was common, or what was not on its road to progression or increase or sanctification.
Yeah, it's a reference back to the law of Moses, where he said there's some things that are just common and normal, in everyday life. And he says, but the the opposite of that is holy. We were looking earlier at the Bible dictionary.
Yes, I love this. You're going to want to go in your Bible dictionary and mark this because it's going to give us some words for holiness that help us to understand holiness better.
Right, what the word actually means. And so holiness in the Bible dictionary says, according to the Old Testament, which Paul is like, remember, he was an expert in it, and he's really relying on that there. And he says, they are things or places that are holy, were set apart for a sacred purpose.
Oh, isn't that so good to think about that? So consecrated, holy, set apart, those are all the same word, for a sacred purpose. That there was something in mind for that. So you think about the temple, and it says holiness to the Lord on the top because it's set apart for a sacred purpose. It's consecrated for a sacred purpose. And I love that the same is true about us. That's what Paul's saying. You have been set apart for a sacred purpose. As we consecrate our life. And I love that quote Brigham Young shared, every moment of my life must be holiness to the Lord. And I love just that thought of that as we look at all the moments of our life, how many of them are we just common? And how many of them are we really feel like we are set apart for a sacred purpose? purpose in that moment.
Yeah, and I love that idea of being called to that. Like God is beckoning us to live in a way that is set apart. Not that everything else is bad. He's just like, you just have to live on a different level if you're gonna do the work that I'm hoping you will do. And as you were talking about what's written over the temple, that like this is a place that's set apart for a sacred purpose, and so are we. I love that the high priest in the temple actually wore a mitre cap that said across the forehead, he was marked across the forehead, holiness to the Lord. You know, as a symbol of those who are clothed as priests and priestesses in this place are set apart for a very specific and sacred purpose.
And I think it's important to remember, it's not just talking about people who work in the temple. It's not just talking about people whose job is the church. I have a cute friend, Shani Pothier, who talked about, what if you regarded motherhood as holy? What about holy mothering? What would that look like? And her and I had a conversation on the phone about that one day, and she was like, can changing a diaper be a holy moment? Are there holy moments as we go through our time? And it made me think of one of my other good friends named Geraldine Edwards, who I loved, who said, you know, you think about that moment when you change a baby's diaper, and how many of us realize that in that moment, which happens several times a day, you are eye to eye with that child and 2 feet away from their face. You have a moment where you get to capture that child's attention completely. And are you making use of that moment? And as soon as I read that, I was like, oh, I got to change the way I change diapers. I have to. Because this is a moment that could be a holy moment. And it seriously changed changing diapers for me. It was something I didn't ever like not want to engage in, because I kept thinking, I'm 2 feet away from this child's face and this is my moment. And it's interesting because it is still true about me today as a grandma. When someone needs their diaper changed, and you know the argument that happens because you're closer to having little kids than I am, when you're like, I did the last one. No, I did the last one. And like instinctively, I'm like, oh, I will do it because this is my moment. Right? I know this is my moment. Do you need me to come over? I will come change diapers.
I would rather paint with them or like give them. What if I fed them goldfish? You do this. Okay, I'll look at their face. Right at them. I will look at their face while I put goldfish in their mouth.
Or change their diaper. Everyone. It's just this thought of holy rhythms.
It is kind of cute. Okay. You can do it.
Okay, I will. I'll do it.
We're out of those. But at the same time, too, like I love that you say that. Like all the different. You know, it's funny that the opposite of holiness is common, but not common in that you can take common experiences and make them holy experiences.
Yes.
Which is what, you know, what you're saying here. And as a dad, like sometimes I'm just like, I remember I was working full time and doing a master's program, and I came home after work and school one day and everybody was already in bed, and I sat in my kitchen and I just cried. I was just like, I'm doing so much and this is so hard and this is so heavy. And then I just remember having this moment of reassurance. I was like, oh, but what you're doing is laying a foundation of protection and laying a foundation of providing for this family. And I remember going to like the little kids' rooms and just looking and all of them and being like, but the work I'm doing is a holy work to take care of these littles. And I love that
what Paul is going to tell us is, you've been called unto holiness, but if it feels overwhelming to you, don't worry, because in verse 8, God, who hath given unto us his Holy Spirit, we have a tutor, we have a personal tutor who is going to help us figure out how to make the rhythms of our life more holy.
Set apart for that purpose.
Yes, set apart for that purpose. Whatever that rhythm is, anything in your life, the Holy Spirit can help you know how to make that holy. And then I love in verse 11 when he gives us this counsel that is so good. It is so good for our time. It's just this little tiny phrase, and it says, study to be quiet. Which there is so much power in that one phrase. Like you could just think about that one phrase for one whole day. That is how powerful it is. And it made me think about conference that we just had the opportunity to listen to, because one of the things I noticed several times in conference is how many people told us, go set apart a quiet place. Go find a spot that is going to be quiet for you. And I wrote an Instagram post just a couple weeks ago, probably, where I talked about one of my favorite things to do is mow the lawn. And then I found out it's also President Nelson's one of his favorite things to do. In fact, it's a job he didn't give up when they told him he had to get rid of most of his jobs, because he said it is the place where he connects with God the most. And that is the same reason why I love it. So then I was like, oh, see, I'm not as crazy as my kids think I am, because if they think I'm crazy, then the prophet. And so
we love PS. Listen, if y'all don't like to mow the lawn or change babies' diapers, you could still be a holy person. Like you are.
It's totally fine. I also talked about driving tractors in there, because this is the thing. It is so loud. No one wants to talk to you when you're doing that thing. No. When I mow the lawn, my kids are like, don't go out there. She's mowing the lawn. They think if they come out, I'm going to be like, hey, take over. I'm not going to. I love mowing the lawn. I'm not going to make anyone do it. Just
this is why Jenny wants to mow the lawn.
Yes.
She was just like, and I was like, no, you're not mowing the lawn because the neighbors will see you and they'll judge me. And then she was like, no, you get to go out and just put in headphones and listen to music and mow and just like.
Yeah, see, that can be a quiet place.
Yeah.
Just find your quiet place, whatever it is. You study to be quiet somewhere, because that Holy Spirit, it's going to talk to you in those places where no interruptions can come. And if you want to drive a tractor or mow the lawn, fine.
Or change diapers. That's not a
not
quiet moment.
That doesn't count.
I was going to say, I do love that it says that you have to, oh, my friend's calling. That you have to study to be quiet.
Yes.
Because like that, it's not natural. Like we have grown up in a culture that is counterintuitive to that. And I don't know if that's like the natural man or if that's just because of the world we grow up in. Sometimes I think about Joseph Smith and I was like, no wonder he got all those visions all the time. He was just farming. You know, he had all this quiet time. But you and I in this world, we have to actually study how to do that. It's a skill. It's a skill.
For study. Make sure you look at the footnote down here that you're going to endeavor earnestly to be quiet.
Because you have to. It won't come naturally. It's not a natural thing.
It's so interesting. I taught this to my seminary kids. And as we were talking about it, I said to them, okay, I want you to think over the past 24 hours. Like starting from right now, whenever you're listening to this, go 24 hours before. And I want you to write down in your journal which of those moments were quiet. And sleep doesn't count. And all my kids just stared at me. They were like,
we have none.
Nothing. No quiet time. It just is not part of what we do. So it's something we got to set aside. So that's a really great tip. As you look at these rhythms of holiness, we wrote down in there those three things. First of all, you're called to holiness. Second, he's given us his Holy Spirit to help us with holiness. And third, we need to study to be quiet so that will all work in our life.
Okay, this next part I want to talk goes like really nice next to it, because he kind of continues his advice in, did we miss that one we did at the very, very beginning of this? Where's abound and abound? Oh, this one.
We're coming to it.
No, 4.
You're right.
At the very beginning of 4, we love this line at the end of verse 1 where he says, I'm going to show you how to walk and please God so that you would abound more and more. He's like, you're doing great, but do you want to enjoy this, delightful life? Like I said in that other translation, do you want to enjoy more and more? Like more of his spirit, more of, his presence. So he gives this list, and we have right here 11 through 22, which is just a big long list of advice. But we love this line from Paul where he says, the very God of peace will sanctify you wholly. That this is, I was just looking in my institute class at the Sermon on the Mount again. And you remember at the end of chapter 5, Matthew 5, he says, be ye therefore perfect. And we learned that Greek word for perfect means to be whole. I love that this added on with this. It's like, it is the God of peace who's actually going to make you whole. And peace comes from a word shalom, which means wholeness also. The God of wholeness is going to make you whole. But so each of the things in this list are ways that we actually make a connection with him. They're not like things, if we do them all, we become whole, but they're ways that connect us to the God of wholeness so that we can become whole. So that you can just read through that list, and our challenge for you is just to pick one of them. One thing this week that you can focus on to connect you. And we're looking
in 1 Thessalonians 5, if you're wondering where we're talking about.
11 to 22. One thing that's going to connect you with the God of wholeness. And the one I love is verse 16, to rejoice evermore. What have you spent every day, a little bit of time every day, thinking about the things that you can rejoice in? I love when President Nelson ended
so many people
General
talked about
Conference
joy
where he
in
was
General
just-
Conference. I was
but-
so surprised by that theme
Yeah.
all the way through General Conference.
And I was talking to my nephew, Spency, today, and he was just saying, sometimes do you think like because we're talking about how God brought the kingdom to the earth, and it's like now it's filling the earth, you know? That we have this idea in our heads, it's an old like Protestant idea that we left heaven and we came to this earth and it's so rotten and we can't wait to leave it and go back to heaven. But the message of the Bible is that Jesus brought the kingdom to the earth, and now his kingdom is going to overtake the world's kingdom. It's going to fill the world.
And there's going to be happiness.
And I was like, no, it's happening. It's working. And President Nelson ends that talk and he was just like, I wish I could remember the exact phrase. He says, living in this wonderful world, you know? And you're just like, I was like, that's awesome. So I love the idea of spending every day this week just finding something to rejoice about. I think that connects you to God because rejoicing and gratitude are a fruit of the Spirit. So that's one I picked.
And the one I picked that I love is just right by there. In verse 19, it says, quench not the Spirit. If you look at the footnote for that, extinguish or hinder or suppress not the Spirit, which I think is important. I had a mom stop me the other day and she said, I'm trying to teach my daughter about the Spirit. And she said to me, do you think the Spirit leaves? Like, does the Spirit leave you? And it reminded me of a conversation I had with my friend Nish, actually, who had asked me the same thing. And as we talked, we decided between us that the Spirit doesn't really leave. The Spirit is always there. The Spirit is always present. But according to what we are doing in our life, we can hinder or mute what we can hear or extinguish or suppress the Spirit, our ability to be able to hear and respond to the Spirit, as opposed to really increasing our ability to be able to hear directly what the Spirit is trying to tell us. And so it's less about the Spirit coming and going, and it's more about us figuring out, how do I quench not the Spirit? How do I live in such a way that I am not hindering or extinguishing or muting the Spirit, but that I'm living in a way that is allowing me full privilege of that communication with the Spirit, which I think is just an interesting way to think.
Yeah, it's not his presence that's a problem. It's like our awareness and our connection.
And our connection.
Right, that is a problem. So this one that I read at the beginning, I just wanted to tell you, it was in verse 22. I lied. It's in 23. 23 where it says, you know, as you're on this journey of holiness, remember, it is the God of peace who is going to sanctify you wholly. And then 24, I love, says, faithful is he that calleth you. Remember, he called us to holiness, who also will do it.
Oh, I just love it when we're just reminded God doesn't just promise things. He is able also to perform the thing he told us he would do. We have to trust that.
Yeah. Okay, and then,
now we love this in 2 Thessalonians.
Okay, here's the scoop with 2 Thessalonians. So they write this letter, you know, and everything's going great. Then it's not long after that they get word that there's a couple of problems. That not only did the persecution not go away that was happening because they had, you know, made Jesus their king, it actually increased after he wrote the letter. So they started to try and live this after these rhythms of holiness, and then the persecution increased. And so Paul was like, oh no. And then also there's this crazy rumor. So the first part, chapter 1, is all about like this, like, okay, you guys, listen, I know the persecution has increased, but you're actually living the same story Jesus lived. It's like, remember, he was inaugurated as king through suffering. And when you suffer, just remember you are living his same story. And so he's encouraging them there. And then the second chapter, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, is there had been this rumor that someone had been saying, Paul said that Jesus has actually already come to the earth. He's already taken the faithful with him. And then everybody who's left, you know, sorry, you got left behind. So there was a lot of distress. People were like beside themselves.
Saying from the head of the church, and everyone was coming in and trying to say what the church was saying, what they thought the church was saying.
Right.
So they had to come up with a system of how do they know if it's really going to be from the church.
Right. Is this what's actually happening? So you've got just a lot of people who are just
And one of the ways that they did that we recognize is you start seeing Paul sending all of his letters with someone who they could trust.
Right.
That's why Timothy is delivering so many letters. People are going to come. We're going to read of other people who come bringing these letters that are signed and sealed by Paul. But instead of just sending them, he doesn't have the luxury of doing that. He's having to now send them with people who are trusted members of the church so that they know this is a real live letter.
And he even writes, what's fun at the end of this one in chapter 3, he says, I'm writing this in my own handwriting a little bit. Usually he had a scribe, and he was like, and at the end he was like, and I'm going to write this in my own handwriting so you know this really is from me. So, but the issue is, right, that's what he's trying to do to help prevent this. But what's happening is you've got what's going on in this chapter is we've written, we have two different boxes here. One of them is this idea of don't let anyone deceive you. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm trying to help you not get deceived by all these messages that are coming from everywhere. And then the other side of that is
the people who are defecting,
right,
who are going with. And so it might be helpful if we just read verses 1, 2, and 3, and then we're going to let you look at all of chapter 2. We're going to tell you a couple lines we love. But he just says, we beseech you by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and by our gathering together unto him. So right off the bat, he's going to tell them there is an importance in why we gather together. And the same is true today, right? There's a reason why we gather with our family to study. There's a reason why we gather as a church congregation. There's a reason why we gather at general conference. That there's something about the gathering that strengthens testimony. And
there's even a reason that we gather together as a ward council or the new youth councils. There's a reason that the quorum of the 12 gathers and unitedly says things together.
And I love that he tells us what it is in verse 2, that ye be not soon shaken in mind or troubled. That's why we're gathering. We don't want you to be shaken, any of us, any of these people. So this gathering together and this call from a prophet, President Nelson is so intent on this gathering. We keep hearing him talk about it. And part of the reason for that is because it's one of the things that's going to help us not be shaken in the last days. And he tells us, I don't want you to be shaken in mind or troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter, as if from us, that the day of Christ is at hand, right? He's telling them, there's all three of these things could deceive you. And our gathering together is going to help prevent that. Let no man deceive you by any means. For that day shall not come, except there shall come a falling away first, and the man of sin be revealed. So he tells them there is going to be an apostasy. There is going to be this time of falling away, and our job is to keep you safe. It's interesting because when you look at that word apostasy,
which comes from
the Greek,
the falling away, the Greek of falling away is apostasia, which was where we get the word apostasy.
And it's so interesting because it's not just someone being like, well, I don't think I want to be part of this anymore, and they just quietly go away. That is not the word that is being used here. It's actually the word that's being used means a defection, or a standing against, or a revolt. It's more than just a turning away. It's actually has more behind it.
It's a rebellion.
Yeah, that's a rebellion. That is it's so forceful in the leaving that I think it's important that Paul says this is what's going to happen. Either you can gather together and not be shaken, or there is going to be this defection. There's going to be this falling away and this revolt. Yeah. And he's going to tell us what that looks like. And some of these words he tells us under this defecting are so interesting. Falling away is one of them. But he tells us, I wish I would have marked exactly where these are. In verse 10, there's a deceivableness of unrighteousness in them. And in verse 7, the mystery of iniquity. You're going to see some lines in here that he's just describing what it looks like to be shaken and the tools someone would use to be able to do that. But then there's a whole list here.
And when you see these, when you study these, you're going to find a line that talks a little bit about God's punishment. If you look carefully at it, what it's teaching is that God will give those people what it is they actually want. And if someone does not, if they want to defect, if they don't want to be in his presence,
if they want to believe a lie, is what it tells you. If you want to believe a lie, he's not going to take away our agency. He's
Right.
going to allow us. If that's what we want, is to believe the lie, then he's going to allow us to believe the lie. But the beauty is he's not going to give up on us easily. I love this list that he tells us what's going to happen, how he's going to try and hold on to us. And he goes through, and there's just a lot of different things. We're going to gather together. He's going to sanctify us. We believe truth. We stand fast to tradition and hold fast. We're going to be established in good. So as you go through this chapter 2, you want to be looking for both sides of that. What it looks like to defect, what it looks like to not be deceived. And just make a list of what that looks like, and then think about, particularly in our day and our time, we want to end with this part that we just love. Paul talks about as we near the second coming, what that's going to be like in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And he's going to start out talking about that you're not in darkness. We hear so often that day is going to overcome us as a thief.
Yeah, he says that in verse 2. He's like, the prophecy is that the Lord's going to come as a thief in the night. But then he reassures them, right?
This is so good.
In verse 5, and he says, but you're the children of light and the children of day. We're not of the night, and we're not of darkness. He says, so you won't be deceived. These things will... he's going to come as a thief in the night to those who sleep during the day. That's what he says. For those who are sleep in the day or who are drunk during the day, that's who it'll be a surprise to. He's like, but these things are going to be really obvious to you children of light. And I love that hopefulness of the entire thing.
I do too.
Also, just the hopefulness of the apostasy means defection. It means rebellion. It means a revolt. It doesn't mean like I'm confused or I'm wondering or I'm working through things. He's like, no. That's what you want to do. Work through those things.
Gather together with these people and
ask the questions and work through.
I love that one comment in conference that said, if you are questioning your faith, was it Elder Holland? Go to people who actually have some. And I thought, I just love that. Who do you know that it represents faith to you? Who is it? Because go sit down with that person and say, do you have a second? We could just talk through some of these things.
Yeah, not that it'll be solved in one conversation, but just keep doing that. So I love that. Children of light are those who are seeking light. And when someone's asking a question, a sincere question, that is the definition of seeking light. And so it's a very, very, it sounds a little scary when you get into like mystery of iniquity or something, but he is super, super hopeful about it and telling them, y'all, don't worry. We're teaching you how to do this. We're all together in this. Nobody's going to be bamboozled. Is that a good word to end on?
and we're going to gather, right? We're going to bring these people in. The door is always open to come in, and that's the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. You have to choose. You have to choose that you don't want to be part of that.
Right. Because otherwise, remember, his spirit is always present and is going to be reaching and, inspiring.
And ours is a message of gathering. It just is. It's a message of welcoming and belonging and come.
As you are.
Yep. So good.
Okay. See you next week.